In 1873, the Morning Chronicle described 23-year-old Catherine Foster as a woman of abandoned character who had surrendered herself entirely to immoral passions. It was a cruel label, designed to turn public sympathy against her, to make her execution more palatable to the crowds who would gather at Maidstone Gaol. But who was Catherine Foster before the newspapers branded her a murderess? And how did a young woman's desperate attempt at love end with her standing on the scaffold? To find out, we have to go back to the beginning, before we uncover her story. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, please don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to support the channel. It really helps us bring more of these hidden histories to light. Our story begins not in a courtroom, but in the rural parish of Acton, just west of London. The 1861 census for England and Wales gives us our first glimpse of Catherine Harris. We find her aged 11, living with her family in a modest cottage on Churchfield Road. The Harris household consisted of 5 people, crammed into what was likely no more than 2 rooms. Catherine's father, Thomas Harris, was a 42-year-old agricultural laborer, one of thousands of men whose livelihoods were being steadily eroded by mechanization and enclosure. Her mother, Mary Ann, aged 38, supplemented the family income with needlework taken in from wealthier households. Catherine had 2 younger sisters, Elizabeth, 9, and Margaret, just 6 years old. Yet within this crowded and economically precarious world, there was order, there was family. Thomas Harris's occupation is significant. Agricultural labourers occupied the lowest rungs of rural Victorian society, earning perhaps 10 to 12 shillings per week, barely enough to keep a family fed. They lived in constant fear of injury, seasonal unemployment, and the workhouse. Even more telling is what the census lists for 11-year-old Catherine, scholar. This one word speaks volumes. The Education Act of 1870 was still 9 years away when Catherine was counted in the 1861 census, meaning her schooling was likely sporadic, paid for penny by penny from her father's meager wages. Yet someone, probably her mother, believed education mattered. Catherine could read and write, skills that would separate her from many working-class girls of her generation. In 1861, she was a girl with a home, a family who cared enough to keep her in school, and the promise of something better than the fields that had broken her father's back. She was a girl with a chance. But by 1871, the picture has changed dramatically. Catherine's childhood seems to have vanished with brutal swiftness. The census of that year locates the Harris family still in Acton, but Thomas's occupation is now listed as pauper laborer, a devastating downgrade that speaks of injury, age, or economic collapse. Mary Ann takes in washing. Elizabeth and Margaret, now 19 and 16, work as domestic servants in neighboring households. Catherine, now 21, is not with them. We find her instead at 14 George Street, Marylebone, an address in one of London's most notorious neighborhoods for poverty and vice. The census records her as Catherine Harris, single woman, age 21, general servant. But other records tell a different story. A police register from the summer of 1871 identifies Catherine Harris of George Street as having been cautioned for loitering for the purposes of prostitution on 3 separate occasions. No charges were filed. Victorian police often gave young women warnings before prosecutions. But the pattern was being established. The authorities were watching her. What happened between 1861 and 1871? How does a girl who was kept in school, who had a family home however humble, end up walking the streets of Marylebone? The answer, tragically common for working-class Victorian women, was likely domestic service gone wrong. Young girls entered service at 13 or 14, sent by families who could no longer afford to feed them. They were vulnerable to sexual exploitation by employers, their sons, or other male servants. Once a girl's virtue was compromised, whether by assault or consensual relationship, she was unemployable in respectable households. Character references, the currency of domestic service, would be denied, and without references, there were precious few options for survival. The moral judgment was swift and merciless. While the men who exploited these young women faced no consequences, the women themselves were labeled fallen and treated as moral contagions to be avoided by decent society. Just 3 months after those police cautions, on the night of April 2, 1871, the census enumerator came knocking. The record for 14 George Street, Marylebone, tells us everything about where Catherine's life stood. The building housed 16 people across multiple rooms. A lodging house where privacy was impossible, and respectability even less so. Catherine is listed as a general servant, but the presence of 3 other young single women with the same occupation in the same house suggests something more complicated. Victorian lodging houses in areas like Marylebone often served as bases for women engaged in street walking, offering cheap beds between their nightly searches for clients. This separation from her family, at such a formative age, would have been a profound trauma, severing her from the rural stability of Acton, and placing her in one of London's most morally policed districts, where women like her were assumed to be criminals simply by virtue of their poverty and circumstances. It's in this world that Catherine met John Foster. The marriage register for St. Mary's Church, Marylebone, records their union on November 14, 1871. Catherine Harris, spinster, aged 21, married John Foster, bachelor, aged 35, engineer. Catherine signed her name in a clear, confident hand, evidence of that schooling her mother had fought to give her. Witnesses were 2 strangers pulled in from the street, suggesting no family attended from either side. John Foster seemed, at first, like salvation. He had a skilled trade. Engineers earned respectable wages, perhaps 30 shillings per week. He was 14 years Catherine's senior, established, ostensibly stable. For Catherine, marriage meant escape. From the streets, from the police cautions, from the nightly degradations of Marylebone. It meant respectability restored. By the 1872 rate books for the parish of Acton, we find John and Catherine Foster listed as tenants of a small cottage on Mill Hill Road, back in Catherine's home parish. Perhaps close enough for her to reconnect with her family. John's occupation is given as mechanical engineer employed at the gasworks. For a brief moment, Catherine's life seems to have stabilized. She had a husband, a home, a respectable address. She was no longer the watched woman of Marylebone, but Mrs. Foster of Mill Hill Road. But respectability, for women like Catherine, was always conditional, and the conditions were about to shatter. It's here, in the summer of 1872, that her life unravels completely. The turn of events is captured not in census records, but in the careful documentation of a murder investigation. On September 8, 1872, John Foster returned home from the gasworks complaining of severe stomach pains. Catherine made him tea. Within an hour, he was vomiting violently. By midnight, he was convulsing. A doctor was called, Dr. William Creswick of Acton, who diagnosed acute gastritis and prescribed bismuth and morphine. But John Foster continued to deteriorate. On September 11th, John Foster died in agony. Dr. Creswick, troubled by the violence of the symptoms, refused to sign a death certificate without a post-mortem examination. The autopsy revealed what he suspected: massive quantities of arsenic in John Foster's stomach, liver, and intestines, enough to kill 3 men. The inquest opened on September 13th at the Red Lion in Acton. Catherine Foster, newly widowed, sat before the coroner's jury wearing black crepe and maintaining, according to the Acton Gazette, an expression of bewildered grief. The evidence against her mounted with devastating speed. Emma Wright, a neighbor, testified that Catherine had purchased the penneth of arsenic for rats from Mr. Tolley's chemist shop on Mill Hill Road on September 6, 2 days before John's symptoms began. The chemist confirmed the sale and produced his poison register, which Catherine had signed as required by the Arsenic Act of 1851. But it was the testimony of another witness that transformed Catherine from grieving widow to accused murderess. Mary Harrington, who had lodged with the Fosters for 3 weeks that August, told the court that Catherine had spoken openly of her hatred for her husband. According to Mary's testimony, Catherine complained that John was a brute when drunk and had struck her on multiple occasions. More damningly, Mary claimed Catherine had said she wished he was dead and that she knew how to manage it. Then came the revelation that would seal Catherine's fate. Letters were produced, letters between Catherine and a man named William Maynard, a laborer she had known before her marriage. The letters, read aloud to the gasping court, revealed an ongoing affair. In one, dated August 20, 1872, Catherine wrote, "My dearest William, I cannot bear this life much longer. John suspects nothing, but I dream of the day when we might be together without shame. Your devoted Cath." Maynard's replies were equally damning. "Be patient, my love. All things pass. Perhaps sooner than you think." The coroner's jury deliberated for less than an hour. Their verdict, willful murder by Catherine Foster. Catherine Foster's trial at the Old Bailey in December 1872 became a sensation. The newspapers, hungry for scandal, depicted her as the embodiment of female depravity, a woman who had betrayed the sacred bonds of marriage for lust. The Morning Chronicle of December 3, 1872, described her as a woman of abandoned character who had surrendered herself entirely to immoral passions. The Illustrated Police News published lurid engravings showing Catherine administering poison to her trusting husband while William Maynard lurked in the shadows outside. The prosecution, led by Mr. Sergeant Ballantyne, painted Catherine as a cold-blooded schemer who had married John Foster for respectability while continuing her illicit relationship with William Maynard. When John became an inconvenience, she eliminated him with the efficiency of a practiced poisoner. Catherine's defense attorney, Mr. Montague Williams, argued that the evidence was circumstantial. Yes, Catherine had purchased arsenic. Yes, she had complained about her marriage. Yes, she had conducted an affair. But none of this proved she had administered poison to her husband. Perhaps John had taken the arsenic himself, intentionally or accidentally. Perhaps someone else had access to the cottage. The jury was unconvinced. Victorian juries rarely sympathized with adulteresses. And Catherine's past, those police cautions from Marylebone, her time on the streets, was introduced to demonstrate her immoral character. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Their verdict, guilty. Mr. Justice Blackburn placed the black cap upon his head and pronounced sentence of death. Catherine Foster, he declared, had violated every sacred duty of a wife and deserved no mercy. She would hang by the neck until dead. In the prisoner's dock, Catherine collapsed, shrieking, "I am innocent. William, tell them I'm innocent." But William Maynard was nowhere to be found. He had fled London the day after Catherine's arrest, and never testified at her trial. The final document in Catherine Foster's life story is not a death certificate, but a prison register entry. On the morning of January 7, 1873, Catherine Foster, aged 23, was executed at Maidstone Gaol. She was the first woman hanged in Kent in over 30 years. The night before her execution, she confessed to the prison chaplain. According to his report, archived in the prison records, Catherine admitted to purchasing the arsenic and putting it in John's tea. But her motive, she insisted, was not premeditated murder born of lust. It was desperation, born of terror. John Foster, she claimed, had discovered her letters to William Maynard. He had beaten her savagely, threatened to drag her through the courts for adultery, to see her imprisoned and publicly shamed. Divorce in 1872 was available to men on grounds of adultery alone, but it meant utter ruin for the woman, social death, unemployability, destitution. Catherine would be branded an adulteress in the newspapers, her past on the streets of Marylebone exposed, her family name destroyed. In that moment of terror, with John raging and her entire precarious existence about to collapse, She had put the arsenic in his tea. Not for love of William Maynard. For fear of what John Foster would do to her. The chaplain's report notes. She wept bitterly and expressed remorse, though continued to insist she had acted in a moment of desperation, not premeditation. No family members attended her execution. Her parents and sisters, if they knew, stayed away, unwilling or unable to be associated with a convicted murderess. The crowd that gathered to watch numbered over 300. Many were women, there to see what became of adulteresses who thought they could escape the bonds of marriage through murder. Catherine Foster died at 8 a.m., January 7, 1873, on the scaffold at Maidstone Gaol. Utterly alone. Catherine Foster's story shows how Victorian society offered women like her no escape from impossible situations. She was condemned for loving the wrong man. But more fundamentally, she was condemned for trying to escape a marriage that had become intolerable. It was a cycle of judgment, punishment, and moral condemnation from which there was no exit. The legal system that would grant John Foster a divorce for Catherine's adultery also ensured that divorce would destroy her completely. The same society that tacitly accepted married men keeping mistresses reacted with horror at married women seeking love outside their vows. But where do you think it all went wrong for Catherine? Was it the moment she entered domestic service and became vulnerable to exploitation? Was it when she married John Foster, perhaps hoping for security but finding something darker? Or was her path set the moment she became a woman in Victorian England, where one misstep, one lost position, one lost reference, one night on the streets, marked you forever as fallen? Was there truly a single turning point? Or was her execution simply the final act in a tragedy written by a society that valued women's chastity above their lives, their obedience above their safety, and their silence above their truth?